Hi, I'm David Znidarsic, and I'm here to talk with you about scoring security vulnerabilities with CVSS version 3. CVSS stands for Common Vulnerability Scoring System. It's the only scoring system that's used by multiple companies. The version 3 scores started to appear about 12 months ago, and some organizations still use version 2, and some publish both 2 and 3 scores. There's 3 categories of metrics that comprise a single CVSS score. The base metrics that are independent of time and place, and they're subdivided into exploitability metrics, that is, how difficult is it to exploit this vulnerability, and impact metrics, that is, what is the consequence of an exploit. And we'll talk about direct consequences in a second. The second category is temporal metrics. Those adjustments that are made based on the current situation, like is there a workaround available? And then finally, environmental metrics, adjustments based on how the software or the hardware that is vulnerable is deployed. The goals of CVSS is to add objectivity over subjectivity to avoid arguments like the following: it's severe, no it's not. Yes, it is. It blends, at a minimum, 8 metrics to create this objectivity. Now, some metrics are themselves objective, and some metrics are subjective. An objective metric is, does the attacker need credentials? They either do or they don't. More subjective is the vulnerability easy to exploit? Well, you may get different answers from different people for that question. But the blend of at least these 8 metrics, even if some of them are subjective, create a much greater sense of objectivity than alternatives that we've seen in the past. And there's a focus on the direct impact of the vulnerability. If you consider chained impacts, if this happens, then if that leads to something else, which leads to something else, there's a danger that every vulnerability is going to be considered critical. Best practice of CVS is when you measure the impact of a vulnerability, you're measuring the direct impact. So who calculates CVSS scores? Well, anybody can calculate CVSS scores. 2 scores can give different scores. And as new things are learned, score can change. The base and the temporal scores are usually done by people who know the vulnerable component. People are knowledgeable about it. Usually the author of the software. However, there are examples of many CVSS scores that are calculated by the person who found the vulnerability, even though they may not be the author of the software. The environmental metrics are usually scored by someone who knows how that component is deployed in that particular environment. But again, sometimes environmental scores are calculated or discerned by, say, the owner of the software or the founder of the bug or the vulnerability, because they make certain assumptions about the environment. For the same vulnerability, the environmental metrics might be different for one customer versus another. This is based on the environment. There may be certain ways in which a customer deploys a particular piece of software that is different than another. The scores range from 10.0 to 0.0. 0.0 means it's not a vulnerability. 10.0 is the most critical. Now, there's different categories here that are listed in the CVSS specification: critical, high, medium, and low. The problem there is that those are just words associated with the scores. What matters is the actions that are associated with the score. So if there's an organization that takes certain action for scores between 7.5 and 10.0, well, the name associated with it, the fact that it might span these 2 categories here of critical and high, are not relevant. What's relevant is what one does with that score. There are online CVSS calculators. First.org is the one that I use because they own the CVSS version 3 specification, you could find that calculator there. There's other calculators at other places. Online, there are calculators which are written as Python modules, Excel modules, and so forth. So how do you publish a CVSS score once you create it? Well, publishing just the score, like 7.1 for example, is good for determining action if your action is based on the particular CVSS score. But publishing only that score makes it difficult to revise. Every time you calculate a CVSS score, you're given a CVSS vector, and it's a set of keyword value pairs which detail the individual metrics that you've chosen. In this case, this is a vector of a CVSS 3.0 score with 8 keyword value pairs. We'll describe the keyword values later, but it suffices to say that these are the subcomponents necessary to calculate that score. Now, if you want to change one of those components, if you learn something new and you want to change a metric, you start with that vector that you see here, and then you modify just the one score, one metric, to get a different score. But even better, if you publish the vector URL, then the reader can click on that URL and be taken to the same online CVSS calculator that you used, and that will be pre-populated with the vector's metrics. So here's an example of a link to first.org's calculator, where you'll see at the end that's the exact same vector as I've specified in the second bullet up there. But if you click on that link, you go to an online calculator. In the next slides, I will explain each metric. Base metrics. Again, we talked about the exploitability and the impact, and we'll talk a little bit about scope. Exploitability metrics are the conditions before the attack occurs, and there's 4 of these metrics. The attack vector. Is it N? The attack can come from the internet. Is it A? The attack must come from a LAN. L? The attack can only occur when the attacker is logged in locally to the vulnerable computer, or the computer with the vulnerable software on it. Or P, must the attacker actually have their hands on the vulnerable machine, either hands on the keyboard of the vulnerable machine or access to the switches on a given device. Next is attack complexity. This one is one of the more subjective ones. Is it an easy, simple step attack, or is it a difficult multi-step attack? Next, the privileges required. Are there any credentials required in order to affect this attack? If no, then it's N. If you have to be logged in with a user level account, L. And if you have to be an admin, then it's high. Privileges required. And as you can imagine, the score is much higher, meaning much more severe, if you don't require any credentials, and much lower if you have to be an admin to log in, if the attacker has to be an admin in order to affect the attack. And the final exploitability metric is user interaction. Is there any user interaction required? No, or you need action by an unwitting user. You need to trick them to click on a link or open an attachment or visit a particular location. Scope. If the attack involves, if the attack itself elevates the privilege of the attacker, then the scope would be C. That's the score you would give it. If not, then you score it as U. Now the impact is such that you calculate the impact based on the scope. So if the attack has increased the scope, then when you answer these questions about confidentiality, integrity, and accessibility, you consider that larger scope. So confidentiality. Has any data been breached? No. Some. Or there's been a full data breach. And by full data breach, I mean the attacked component, all the data in the attacked component. It doesn't necessarily mean full data in the whole data center. It just means it has the confidentiality of that vulnerable component. Has all the data been breached in that component? Integrity. Are the results returned by that vulnerable component still reliable? Are some results unreliable, or is it completely unreliable? In other words, has the attacker been able to change how the vulnerable component responds to a query such that you can't rely on the results of that query? And finally, accessibility. Has there been any denial of service? Or can it result in any denial of service? No, or perhaps some intermittent denial of service, or full denial of service. And full denial of service can include the situation where, let's say, a malicious packet crashes a server. If the server comes back up, if the attacker can just resend that packet and crash the server again, then that's full denial of service. It means they've can shut it down reliably again and again and again. The temporal metrics. These can only lower the score or keep it the same. The score calculated from the base metrics that we saw on the previous slide assume the worst case. It assumes that the vulnerability has been reproduced. It will reliably cause the exploit. It is a widely known technique, and it's not fixed, and there's no workaround. So if all those are true, then the temporal metrics have no effect, because then that's the worst case, and that's already been assumed. But if any of these have not the case, if there's, for example, it's not a reliable technique that's widely known. If it's a reliable technique but not widely known, then it doesn't get the H score under exploit code maturity. It gets the F score. If it's just a proof of concept, if it's impractical or incomplete, then it gets the P score. If it's just theoretical, somebody's just saying this could happen and doesn't have any code to show it, then it's given a U. And if you have no knowledge of the technique, if you can't discern which one of these four other metrics are the case, then you just say X and you have no knowledge of it, and it won't affect the score. Same with remediation level. If you have no knowledge of a fix or a workaround, then it doesn't affect the score. But if it has been fixed or temporarily fixed or a workaround exists, then those metrics will reduce the overall score. And report confidence, somewhat related to exploit code maturity. But if you have little confidence in the validity of the report, it's just somebody out there that's taken a guess, then you would give that a U. If you haven't reproduced it, but you suspect that there's a validity to the report, then you give it an R. And then if it has been confirmed, meaning you've reproduced it, or someone who you believe is a reliable source says that they've reproduced it, then that's a C. For environmental metrics, there's two types of environmental metrics. One is metrics such as confidentiality, integrity, and accessibility requirements. We've seen those before in base metrics. But these environmental metrics are not a measure of the vulnerability's impact. It's a measure of the importance of the vulnerable component. And an example, which I have at the bottom, is let's say you have a corporate calendar that is protected by a piece of code. If that code is vulnerable such that the entire corporate calendar can be divulged to an unauthorized person, then the confidentiality has been fully breached. And that's why you'd get a C:H score. You'd give that in the base metrics. But the corporate calendar, it's not that important, low importance. So your confidentiality requirements in your organization are such that the breach of that corporate calendar is low. So the severity of the vulnerability would be tempered by the fact that the corporate calendar is not that important in your organization. So if the vulnerable component caused either a data breach or a loss of integrity or denial of service, the evaluation of these three is, well, how bad is that to this particular customer? You either don't know, or it's a limited effect, like the corporate calendar example, or it's a serious effect, or it's catastrophic. And these are the words used in the CVSS specification. So there's another type of environmental metrics, which are overrides. So each base metric that we saw, the 8 base metrics above, can be overridden in the environment by an environmental metric. This means that in the broadest sense, the base metrics describe what possibly can happen. The environmental metrics say, in this environment, this can't happen, or maybe even worse. So it goes both ways. You can have mitigating circumstances in the environment that decrease the severity of any of the base metrics. And an example is, our server is vulnerable to a malicious denial of service network packet, but this particular customer deploys their own web application firewall in front of that server. So accessibility is bad. The exploit is bad for accessibility because our server is affected by this malicious denial of service packet. But because of the web application firewall, the modified accessibility, MA as opposed to A, is no, there's no effect whatsoever because the WAF blocks the packet. So that would decrease the severity of the accessibility-based metric. Now this is a little bit of the next one is a little bit of a contrived situation, but there could be unique situations in your environment where you can increase the severity of any base metric. So say a customer scripts the mouse and keyboard input to our client product in order to bypass user interaction, and the client and the attacker uses that script. Well, the base metric would be, hey, in its normal use, the user interaction is required in order to affect this exploit. But in this case, there is no user interaction because the script bypassed user interaction. And so for this particular customer, the MUI, modified user interaction, is none. There is none. And that will increase the score because it's higher score if you don't require user interaction. So for all of these 8 environmental overrides that correspond to the base metrics, you can specify X if the environmental factor doesn't change the base metric. Now, you can specify the environmental metric to be the same as the base metric. In this case, you could say there was a requirement for user interaction, and in my environment there still is a requirement for user interaction. And you could say UI:R and MUI:R, but that would only confuse the customer. So confuse the reader of the vector. So I recommend that if that's the case, you just specify X, which tells everyone the environment did not change this base metric. And my final slide is, what is the final score? The environmental score is the final score. If you look at CVSS calculator on first.org, it shows all 3 scores. There's a base score, a temporal score, and an environmental score, and it all shows them with the same emphasis, same color, same boldness. Well, the environmental score considers the base metrics, temporal metrics, if any, and environmental metrics, and overrides, if any. So that is the final score you use in your calculation of what your actions should be. Thank you very much.